Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Hello, my visionary friends. Thank you for joining us on another exciting adventure into future possibilities. This is Mission Evolution, where we share innovative thoughts and information with today's leading experts, bringing the latest knowledge to support your evolutionary process. You're a very important part of this discussion. Email info@missionevolution.org with any comments or questions. We'll address them on the very next show. So take notes, sit back, and enjoy. This hour we'll be exploring when sound becomes visible. Sound is something we tend to take for granted, never giving it much thought. Unless we're hearing impaired, it's something that's always been there, even before we left the womb. It may have started with the sound of our own heartbeat or that of our mother, but as soon as we developed enough to hear, it's been part of our experience. There are schools of thought that indicate some sounds can be detrimental to our health, while others can aid in healing. What are these hidden properties of sound? How do they impact us? Can sound make us ill? Is there any truth behind the concept of healing with sound? Can working with sound fine-tune us and aid our evolution? With us this hour to delve more deeply into sound and its many hidden properties, including becoming visible, is acoustics pioneer and author of Egyptian Sonics, John Stuart Reid. John is a man on a mission to educate and inspire the world in the field of Cymatics, the study of visible sound, and sound therapy, the healing power of sound. His Cymatics research includes a study on how dolphins see with sound, published in the Journal of Marine Biology, and differentiating between the sounds emitted by healthy cells and cancer cells, published in the Water Journal. His website, CymaScope.com. John, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, Gwilda.
So let's start out with, what's your educational background?
Well, I started life as an engineer. I've become a scientist in the last 20 years or so of my life, but initially I was an acoustics engineer, so I spent almost 30 years in kind of standard acoustics. This is before I became interested in Cymatics, the science of visible sound. So I was an acoustics engineer. I ran an acoustics consultancy business for almost 30 years, and it was a pretty standard kind of engineering background. But all of that changed, of course, at one point in my career when I visited Egypt. That's when it really when my story really begins.
So let's start with, what is Cymatics?
Cymatics, spelled with a C, not with an S, of course, but Cymatics, Cymatics. It's basically the science of visible sound. And what we mean by that is that when sound impinges upon a membrane, and in fact there are membranes all around us all of the time, not only the surface of our skin, and really every cell in our body has a membrane, of course, but also all of the day-to-day objects around us, they're all classed from a scientific viewpoint as membranes. And when sound impinges on any membrane, it has to leave what we would term today a cymatic pattern, a pattern of acoustic energy. Of course, it's invisible to the unaided eye, but nevertheless, these patterns are there all around us all of the time, and even in our own bodies, as we'll discuss a little later. So this new science, was really kickstarted by a Swiss medical doctor called Hans Jenny in the 1960s and 70s. He coined this word cymatics to mean visible sound. And he inspired me for sure, because that particular point I was referring to in my career when I visited Egypt all those years ago, I knew very little about cymatics actually at that time, even though I'd been studying acoustics, for all of my career at that point. But cymatics is, at least at that time, was not terribly well known in the field of acoustics.
So, sound, as I understand it, no expert here, but sound is a mechanical wave as opposed to an electromagnetic one like light. Would you help us understand the difference between them and how they relate?
Yeah, for sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that sound is not actually a wave. I know we all use this term. It's a bit of a misnomer, unfortunately, that we're stuck with. I mean, it's not going to change, but the fact is that sound is not a wave. What I mean by that is that all the audible sounds that we make with our own voices and make with sound systems, speaker systems, and so on. All of these sounds, the sounds made by nature, animals in nature, creatures, birds, and so on. All of these sounds are actually spherical. They're literally bubbles of sound. And where this term wave comes in is because the bubble of sound, this sound bubble, is actually oscillating or pulsating in and out. And it's this rhythmic pulsation of the sound bubble, which when graphed appears to be a wave motion, but in reality we are talking about sound bubbles. And it's a strange one, but basically all of these sounds that we've ever heard from our birth have been spherical in their space form. So basically sound is simply the passing on of periodic vibrations, which can be created by, for example, our vocal tract, and these periodic vibrations are leaving now my mouth and my nasal cavities, of course, as a bubble that expands, of course, at the speed of sound. So it is, as you say, it's a mechanical vibration that is, in this case, spherical. And light also is spherical. We talk about light rays and so on. But again, the reality is that all of natural light, at any rate, is spherical in its space form. It will literally propagate away as a bubble of light. So both sound and light are bubbles, excepting in the one case where we're talking about, if we talk about lasers, laser light, of course, is a human-made form of light that does not propagate spherically, but all incandescent light or natural light, such as sunlight, all propagates spherically. But they are two very different scientific phenomena. So first of all, as we've said, sound is a mechanical vibration, right? But light is not mechanical. Light is an electromagnetic phenomena. That means it's magnetism that is oscillating or pulsating, and pulsates at very high frequencies, of course, not like the kind of sound frequencies. But so we can measure both sound and light in terms of frequency, but they are two very different phenomena. However, there is a connection between these two natural phenomena, and it's as follows. If we rub our hands together very vigorously, we know what happens. We hear a slight sound. Of course, the skin in one hand is rubbing past the skin in the other hand, and we hear that sound. But we also feel a beautiful warmth that starts to emerge. And the more vigorous we rub our hands, then the more warmth, more heat is created. Well, what's happening here? Well, basically, the molecules in the skin of one hand are slipping past the molecules of skin in the other hand. Of course, the general term for this is friction, isn't it? We say that there's a frictional force between our two hands when we do this. But what is friction? Well, let's go right down to the atomic level and think about the atoms and molecules that literally are forming the cells of our body, and in this case, in the skin of our hands. At the atomic level, every atom and every molecule is surrounded by a magnetic field. And when our two hands rub together, what's really happening is that the magnetic fields of the molecules and atoms in one hand are slipping past the molecules and atoms in the other hand. In other words, the magnetic fields of both sets of atoms and molecules are literally rubbing past each other. And what we call this in science is an inelastic collision, an inelastic collision. And this means that some energy has to be given up when these magnetic fields interact with each other. And of course, the energy that's given up is heat, right? So this is the point I'm coming to now. I know it's a bit long-winded, but basically, it's a kind of magic that happens, because when we create sound or when we make sound, we can only do it by this mechanical means that we are talking about, for example, with my voice now. And so the information is being passed on from atom to atom, molecule to molecule, as this sound bubble expands away from my mouth. But of course, these collisions that are happening in that sound bubble are inelastic collisions. And this means that some heat has to be generated when this bubble is propagating away from me, right? So that heat that's generated is actually modulated in both frequency and amplitude. And so what this really means is that every time I speak or sing, for example, not that I'm a good singer, but if I make my attempt at singing, what it means is that I'm actually creating a light bubble at the same time that I'm creating a sound bubble. And this is really important, actually. We'll talk later about sound from a healing perspective, but it's very, very important aspect of physics, this connection between sound and light, because we cannot create sound without creating light. The light, of course, is not visible light. It's light in the infrared spectrum that we, commonly term heat, for example. So
is that's the same spectrum that causes us to warm in the sun? Is the ultrared? So you're standing out in the sun, your skin starts to get warm. Infrared. Yeah,
it's infrared, basically infrared light, which is lower in frequency than visible light, but not as high in frequency as ultraviolet light, for example. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But all the sounds around us, everyday sounds, are constantly creating this very small amount of infrared light. The important thing to remember, though, is that the infrared light that's created by all of these sounds is modulated in both amplitude and frequency by those sounds. So let me give you an example here of how this is relevant to everyday life, right? If we go outside and we sing to the sky, okay, like Julie Andrews, standing on top of a hill and singing to the hills and to the sky. When we do that, what happens is that our audible song, will diminish very rapidly. I mean, even if you have a very powerful voice, within about a mile or so, all of the energy that's in your voice will be absorbed by the atmosphere into eventually noise. But of course, what's happened? The energy hasn't been lost. No, it's been transformed into heat. And that heat now radiates away at the speed of light. So this is the infrared light we're talking about.
We are going to have to finish making this connection and connect it to the subject at hand on the other side of a commercial break, but it is time for that break. John and I will return shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, coming to you on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net, and the X Zone TV channel, www.xzonetvchannel.com. again. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. To our faithful and thoughtful audience, we really value your opinion and would love to hear from you. What do you think about the healing properties of sound? Email me at info@missionevolution.org and give me your thoughts or questions so we can all share them on the next show. This in from a member of our audience regarding the episode entitled Restoring Physical Balance as a Key to Evolution. CS states, "Thank you, Gwilda, for this stellar interview with Christopher Vassie. I too resonate with the Terran theory. I'm so happy to hear Christopher's insight around it." Thanks, CS. Christopher was a joy to have on the show and brought some very important insights. Curious, dear audience? Visit our archives at missionevolution.org, listen to the episode entitled Restoring Physical Balance as a Key to Evolution, and let us know what you think. With us this hour discussing the hidden powers of sound is John Stuart Reid. His website, CymaScope.com. John, we were getting into a very fascinating concept that sound, being a mechanical wave, it needs a medium to propagate through, but in the process creates electromagnetic, we were saying bubble, if you will, that then carries further. Would you continue with that thought and how it relates to the subject at hand, i.e. healing with sound?
Absolutely, thank you. We left on something of a cliffhanger, didn't we? But so we were talking about Julie Andrews. I'm mentioning Julie Andrews singing, to the hills and to the sky, and basically that what's happening is that her song is being transformed into light, literally in a form of infrared light, which is radiating away from her as a bubble of infrared light. And because the atmosphere does not unduly absorb infrared light, it can zip through the atmosphere, carrying not the sound of Julie Andrews' voice, but the modulations of her voice in the form of infrared modulations. And these, it's quite a poetic thought, isn't it? That our song will literally travel to the stars as infrared light, as modulated infrared light. And,
that really relates to, a lot of the indigenous people say your words carry to the next generations. Be careful what you say. that really says to align, doesn't it?
Yeah. And also the Buddhist tradition where they have that giant bell in the temple, and they have this belief, they've had this belief for thousands of years, that the sound of the bell radiates across or resonates across the universe. Well, now we know for sure that it does, not as sound, but as modulated infrared light. And this same fact in physics is actually being used right now by astroseismologists. So this is a new field of study. It's part of the field of astrophysics. And in this field of science, astroseismologists can listen in to the sounds of stars. In other words, in the heart of the star, in the furnace of the star, of course, there's a huge amount of sound happening all of the time. And that sound modulates the light of the star in a tiny way, but sufficient to be picked up by a powerful telescope and then demodulated so we can literally hear the sounds inside the star. And this tells the astroseismologists a lot about the atomic physics going on inside stars. But from a more earthly perspective, this concept that every sound ever made is making light has very important implications when we talk about sound healing or sound therapy.
Well, if you're talking about, again, ultra red, we can't see that, but you're saying we can see sound. So do we see sound by observing the medium that it propagates through?
Well, the way that we see sound, the way that sound can be made visible, is simply, using this principle that I mentioned earlier on about the cymatic principle, that whenever you have sound and you have a membrane present, there has to be a cymatic pattern imprinted on that membrane. These are just the simple laws of physics. And one of the wonderful aspects to this law of physics is that scale is totally irrelevant. I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, on the north pole of the planet Saturn, there is a giant hexagon so large that it could swallow 3 Earths. That's just to give you an extreme example of the geometry that's created by sound on, a massive scale. At the other end of the scale, every cell in our body, as I mentioned earlier, has a membrane. And so when the sounds of our own body and sounds from the external environment enter into our body, they also imprint a cymatic pattern on the membrane of our cells. And so
let me clarify something here. Doesn't water also have a membrane? So water has a membrane as well. Does that apply here?
Well, it does apply, but not quite in the way that you're perhaps thinking. So in the instrument that I developed over many years, which is called the CymaScope instrument, it does use water as the primary imprinting medium. So what I mean by that is that the surface of water is exquisitely sensitive to vibration. I think this is generally a commonly known aspect of science. The surface of water is exquisitely sensitive to vibration. So in the development of this CymaScope instrument, having tried many different types of liquid, by the way, including Scotch whiskey, which you can always take a little sip of after you've run the experiment, but I found that no, alcohol did not actually provide the best result. The very best result was simply pure water, and the purer the better. The less solutes in the water, the better. So very, very pure, what we call medical grade water, the type of water that you could inject into your veins very safely. Okay. Well, so when you imprint sound onto the surface of water, you have to imagine that all of the trillions of water molecules are all arranged kind of pell-mell, just very randomly. They're not particularly organized in any way. But when sound is present, the sound literally organizes all of those water molecules. And I'm not just talking about on the surface of the water, I'm talking about right into the depths of the water that we have in this, what we call a cuvette, which is a small fused quartz container of water in the CymaScope instrument. So all of the molecules held in this little cuvette are all beautifully organized as soon as the sound is present. So if you think about this from the point of view of your own body, of course, all of the sounds that are entering your body are similarly organizing the visceral waters in your body that surround all your organs, and also the water that's contained in every cell in your body. Sound has this almost magical property of being able to organize, in other words, to create form from formlessness, and it does so very rapidly.
So that really brings in a whole new focus on the kind of sound that we're exposed to. So we're in the middle of a city and there's a jackhammer going on and traffic and this and that, versus standing out with out on the mountain with the birds and the trees and the breeze. There's quite a difference there, isn't it? Can you speak to that a little?
I can indeed. As a matter of fact, Professor Sung-Chul Ji, who's from Rutgers University, visited us. Actually, we collaborate on many different aspects of science. One particular visit with Sung-Chul Ji concerned an experiment that we conducted with human blood, where we took a vial of human blood. This was recently removed from someone, a blood donor, and warmed it to normal room temperature, and then warmed it further up to 37 degrees C, which is normal body blood temperature. And then we decanted it into 2 smaller test tubes. One test tube goes into a very quiet environment, and the other test tube goes into a musical environment. In other words, an incubator that contains a small speaker, so we can literally play music to that blood. Now, I'll come back to that whole experiment a little bit later in more detail, but what I wanted to share at this point relating to your question was that when we played, instead of playing music to the blood in the incubator, we played white noise. Now, white noise is a kind of random noise, a bit like the sound of standing by a waterfall, for example, or the ocean waves. Although the ocean waves tend to be rhythmic as well. So let's go back to the waterfall model. So the sound of water falling can be very noisy, actually, especially if you get very close to the waterfall, and the sound levels can be very high. In this case, we were creating white noise from a speaker and playing that white noise direct to the blood. Now, I don't want to get into too many technicalities here, but just to say that if you play white noise to blood, as we did at 105 decibels, what happened for us was it literally killed all of the red blood cells in that test tube within 20 minutes. And I mean dead, completely dead within 20 minutes. So you're absolutely right. When you talk about the sound, the very noisy environment of living in cities, it is actually not a healthy environment for us to be in. Far better to be surrounded by nature, of course. And but yes, I can elaborate on that experiment, which was actually a very important experiment, if you wish.
Well, does this relate? I've seen the experiments done with plants where they have a speaker and they have this plant sitting in front of the speaker, and depending on whether they're playing hard rock or classical music, the plants will either lean away from or towards the sound and actually, turn brown and wilt if it's too intense. Is that the same thing going on there?
Well, this is a very strange thing, Gwilda, but like you, we have read about those particular experiments, right? And my own personal view on it is that they are not quite accurate, and I'm going to tell you exactly why I think that. So when we conducted these experiments with music, both Professor Sungchul Ji and myself, we both had this kind of this concept that if we play classical music to the blood, that we would see a much better result. What we were testing for, by the way, was the longevity of red blood cells. How long does the red blood cell live under, for example, music versus a very quiet environment? That was the basic aspect of this, basic premise of this experiment. And we both believed, or we both had this concept in our minds that yes, classical music is bound to have a better result than popular music. But in fact, the reverse proved to be true. The classical music, I know it's amazing, but it's the fact. When we repeated this experiment many times, so we know it's for sure is the situation that the classical music had much less effect on the vitality of the red blood cells than did the popular music. And there's a very good reason for this, that we have eventually figured, because it relates to our own bodies and the base frequencies that our own heart creates when blood is circulating through our system. Obviously the heart has a primary role, which is to circulate the blood. It's a pump and it circulates the blood. But what we've come to believe through this research is that it has a secondary role as well. So the heart is not only circulating the blood, it's also providing low frequency, I'm talking about sound here, low frequency sound pulses that literally spread throughout our whole circulatory system, and they aid the hemoglobin molecules to uptake oxygen that's dissolved in the blood.
Amazing. Well, we'll pick up on this really interesting subject on the other side of yet another commercial pause. John and I will return to our discussion shortly, and we'll get into the heart and its secondary impact on sound. You stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, coming to you on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net, and the X-Zone TV channel, www.xzonetvchannel.com. This is Mission Evolution. Did you know our entire leading-edge, information-packed past episode collection is available to listen or download with our compliments? Visit our archives at www.missionevolution.org for our ever-growing selection of guests and topics. To find out more about me, Gwilda Wiyaka, and the other things I offer, visit findyourpathhome.com. Our special guest this hour is John Stuart Reid. We're speaking about sound made visible. His website, CymaScope.com. John, we entered into the zone of the heart and how popular music is less damaging or less likely to make red blood cells die out early than classical. And then you got into the heart, which triggered me into thinking, okay, now we have indigenous music, we have rhythm, we have the heartbeat rhythm. Does all this relate?
It does indeed. So you're talking there about, for example, indigenous drumming, and that's been an aspect of human culture for thousands of years. It's one of the earliest known musical instruments, of course, was the drum. So coming back to this principle, and by the way, I must say that this is hypothetical right now because we have not yet published papers on this. However, so it's cutting edge information, but certainly from all of the experiments that we've conducted so far, our general view is that the low frequency sound created by the heartbeat causes the hemoglobin molecules that are obviously in every red blood cell to absorb the oxygen readily that's already there dissolved in the blood. And of course, I think it's generally known that oxygen drives the healing processes, almost all of the healing processes in the human body. But this idea, that classical music, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? That classical music is not as, let's say, healing as popular music. I think that most people would agree with that. And so when it comes, to that experiment that you mentioned about plants and playing rock music to plants, that they tend to move away from the rock music and they bend towards the classical music. Well, I have not conducted that experiment myself, but I'm a little bit suspicious now because what is certainly not backing up our own experiment in terms of the results that we saw. And what I'm thinking is, if you play rock music, any kind of rock music to plants at a reasonable level, and I'm talking about in terms of sort of 60 to maybe 80 decibels, that's a reasonable level. And I don't think it's going to harm. It doesn't matter, what the type of music is to some extent. What matters mostly are the frequencies that are in that music. And so I don't think the plants, the cells in the plants, or the cells in our bodies specifically can distinguish music as such. But what they can distinguish are the frequencies within that music. And what we are saying, what Professor G and I are saying, is that the low frequencies in popular music have this effect, this means of making more oxygen available to the cells of our bodies. And the same thing almost certainly is true of plants, although, we have not, as I said, we have not conducted that experiment. In other words, what I'm saying is about the plants, that perhaps the researchers played the rock music at levels which would actually disturb us, never mind the plants, So keep the levels at reasonable, sort of 60 to 80 decibels. And I'm pretty sure that the plants would actually love the rock music, just as they would love almost any form of music. So anyway, the result is very important. Our research is important from the point of view of one of the many mechanisms by which music is actually healing to the human body, and it will become even more important in future years.
If you study, again, the indigenous healing techniques, so many of them involve singing and drumming to the patient or in the presence of the patient. It's starting to make sense with what you're saying.
Absolutely, and also let's not forget the didgeridoo. It's called the yudaki
Hmm.
by the Aboriginals in Australia. That's another wonderful instrument that creates a wonderful range of low frequency sound that again has the same impact that we're talking about to release oxygen in the bloodstream. And so yeah, you know what happens if we lose if our heart stops, we lose consciousness literally within seconds, and that's simply because our brains, of course, are they need a lot of oxygen. So that heartbeat, as soon as the heartbeat stops, the brain will black out basically because it needs all of that oxygen. Well, now let's think about a way we could possibly reactivate that oxygen in the bloodstream by external means. And I'm talking now about low frequency sound. So this is a possible modality of the future where low frequency sound could be applied to someone whose heart has stopped and actually perhaps keep them viable until the heart can be restarted. Do you understand where I'm coming with this?
I do. So, in other words, you're saying introduce the low frequency sound to someone whose heart stopped. It keeps the oxygenation going until you can get the heart going again.
Exactly, it's exactly right. And so, these are exciting aspects of medical science that we're going to be
Absolutely. Hmm.
exploring.
Absolutely. Changing gears a little bit, let's go to Egypt.
Mm. Yeah, well, of course, it was Egypt where this all began for me. As I mentioned earlier in the program, I had been an acoustics engineer for almost 30 years at the point when my daddy and I had been traveling in Egypt, and we were very fortunate to find ourselves in the Great Pyramid alone. It is a sacred place. It's a bit like walking into a cathedral. So any of your listeners that have been there will know exactly what I'm meaning here, because when you're there by yourself or in a very quiet way, like as I was with my dad, um, it, it has a very strong spiritual sense to it, this pyramid and all of the chambers within it. And in this particular instance, as an acoustics engineer, of course, I was very interested in the beautiful resonance of the main chamber, the king's chamber, as they call it, and also the sarcophagus, which is a block of granite. It's rose granite, so it has a nice pinky kind of look to it. And this is granite that has a high quartz content, about 20% quartz, and the granite was originally quarried several hundred miles to the south in Aswan, brought up the Nile, and then eventually, fashioned into a sarcophagus and placed in the chamber. So it's like a coffin, basically, made of granite, solid granite. Well, had always wanted to lie in this sarcophagus and make a vocal glissando, like kind of an unstepped enunciation of a single tone. Why? Well, just to establish what the prime resonant frequency of that sarcophagus was, because it is so exquisitely resonant. If you tap the side of it with your fist, for example, it rings like a low-pitched bell. So you can imagine, from an acoustics engineering viewpoint, I was fascinated by this. So I did lie in it. It's a bit naughty, but I didn't cause any harm. And at one particular frequency, something astonishing happened. It felt like every cell in my body was tingling, and goosebumps broke out all over my flesh. And it was just such an amazing moment in my life. It really changed my life, actually, forever, because that was the experience that led me then to decide to go back to Egypt, but armed this time with acoustics instrumentation, to actually discover, what was that effect? How did it feel? How was it possible that all the cells in my body would feel like they were tingling, and how was these goosebumps created, and so on?
How much later was it from the first experience until you went back with instrumentation?
It was the same year, so
Okay.
my daddy and I had been there early in 96, early in February 96, and later that same year, in the autumn of that year, or the fall as you call it, I returned with all of this acoustics instrumentation, having gained permission, to carry out these experiments. But it wasn't actually the 96 experiments that really changed my life. It was the 97 experiments, because they went back again in 1997, and that's when I conducted a Cymatics experiment with the sarcophagus, and that
So, in
was
other words, you were working with the sarcophagus and
yes,
making sound visible, so you could observe what was going on.
absolutely. In the 96 experiments, they were very standard kind of acoustics experiments that any acoustics engineer would be familiar with. But the 97 experiments were all focused on making sound visible with the sarcophagus. And the purpose of that, of course, Gwilda, was to be able to see the resonances in that sarcophagus. Because, and this is one of the whole points of cymatics, is that when you can see something, you can understand it at a far deeper level than you can perhaps with your other senses. So making sound visible is a very important aspect of this new science. And in the case of the sarcophagus, what I saw were a whole series of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that were emerging on the membrane. I mean, it was a really astonishing moment in my life, which of course I will never ever forget. But the important aspect to this work relating to sound healing is that 3 weeks before going out to carry out these cymatics experiments in 97, I quite badly injured my lower back, and I was in a lot of pain. And so when I entered the pyramid in 97, I was still in extreme pain. I mean, at one point I thought I might have to cancel the whole mission, but I had paid quite a lot of money to the antiquities department. So I just basically, I took more analgesics than perhaps I should have done. I gritted my teeth, and somehow, I managed to get into the pyramid. But having set up the experiment and then seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs emerge on sand, this was not water, by the way, we were sprinkling sand on the membrane stretched across the top of the sarcophagus. Seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs emerged, obviously I was excited. It was an amazing moment in my life. And I actually, in that moment, I suddenly realized that there was no pain in my lower back. All the pain had completely left me. And I thought, this is probably endorphins. I'm very excited. I'm happy seeing this amazing result. And I thought, when I get back outside the pyramid and I get back to the hotel and so on, the pain will come back. But actually, the pain never did come back. And so I reasoned that something very important had happened. Within 20 minutes of making sound in the King's Chamber, all that pain left me when 3 weeks of, analgesics and also physiotherapy, by the way, I'd gone to a physiotherapist. No one was able to help me with this pain, really. And only 20 minutes of sound caused the pain to vanish. So
Well, that balances back out with what you were saying about oxygenation, because oftentimes a lower back injury has to do with musculature that goes into spasm and becomes hypoxic, so it doesn't have enough oxygen. And that causes more pain. It's a splinting cycle, they call it, which causes fear, which causes more tightening, which causes less oxygen. So from what you're saying, it could have impacted by oxygenating the muscles in your back?
Absolutely. That is definitely one of the primary mechanisms that I'm now writing actually on this very subject for a new medical textbook on sound therapy. And so
we're going to have to pick up on the oxygenation and sound therapy and texts on the other side of yet another commercial break. John and I will be back shortly to continue this very interesting discussion, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, coming to you on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net, and the X-Zone TV channel, www.xzonetvchannel.com. This is Mission Evolution, bringing together gifted people of service to the world. I love to hear from our audience. Your thoughts are very important to me. To suggest a topic or guest that you would think would be of interest, email info@missionevolution.org. I'm sure we'll all enjoy them. To find out more about me, Gwilda Wiyaka, my school, and the evolutionary tools we offer, visit www.findyourpathhome.com. This hour, we're sharing thoughts with our special guest, John Stuart Reid. His website, CymaScope.com. John, we were I could go down all sorts of rabbit holes from where we were when we ended the last segment, but the symbols that were showing in the sand, and the sand, I take it, was the propagating agent, the way you were setting up the sound tests. Or were they repeatable? In other words, if you repeated that exact same tone or sound, did those same symbols show back up again, like in the Chladni symbols?
Well, it's a good question, but of course I haven't actually been back to conduct further experiments to be able to prove that very point. But I would imagine that the answer would be yes. And the reason for this is because if you, with Cymatics, providing you have good controls, then you can achieve replicable results. So in this case, what we're talking about here in terms of where did these ancient symbols come from? How did they suddenly pop up, out of an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus? And the answer, or at least the hypothetical answer, relates to a place in Egypt called Nekhen, ancient Nekhen, also known to the Greeks as Hierakonpolis. And this is a town just south of modern-day Luxor in Egypt. And in that town is where the very first development of hieroglyphic language occurred. It's also coincidentally, and I don't think it actually is a coincidence, but it's also coincidentally where the first working of granite in Egypt was conducted. So linking these two ideas together, hieroglyphs with granite, brings us to this hypothesis that it was in this town of Nekhen where they were literally shaping, crafting the sarcophagus for the king's chamber of the Khufu pyramid. We're talking now about 5,000 years ago in this town. They would be working there, right? Now, when you work granite with tools, as they would have had to use, of course, it rings. Granite has this beautiful ringing sound because of the high quartz content. And now we're going to talk very briefly about something called synesthesia, where, some people have this kind of cross-wiring of the senses where they can literally see sound and or taste color.
I didn't know that. Yeah, tell me a little more about that. No, I didn't.
It's a kind of cross-wiring. It's one of the some aspects of physiology that are not commonly known, but certainly, I've met a woman, for example, who could see sounds around her all of the time. And the reason for this, the way that it works, is, as I mentioned much earlier, whenever you have sound and you have a membrane, you have to have a pattern, a cymatic pattern, right? So what happens is, in the cochlea, in your ears, you have membranes, of course. Now, the patterns that are forming on the membranes from the sounds that you're hearing around you, those patterns are suppressed by your brain. If you could see them, it would probably drive you nuts, right? So they're suppressed in favor of simply distinguishing the frequencies in the sound, and ultimately are interpreted by our brain as being the sounds that we can hear. But, and this comes back to me personally actually as well, if I'm on the verge of sleep, Gwilda, and I'm just starting to go to sleep, then, and let's say there's a loud sound suddenly in the room, maybe something drops off a shelf or whatever, right? I can see a beautiful pattern in my mind's eye. I get a shock, of course, because I'm suddenly alert and awake. But in that fraction of a second when the sound happens, I can see this beautiful geometric pattern in my mind's eye. And the reason for that this happens is because of this synesthesia effect that I'm talking about, where for normal people, let's say, that are not synesthetic normally, and I'm not, certainly not normally, but in that moment when my brain is turning my hearing off, right, then and only then I see these sound patterns. Well, let's say now go back to ancient Egypt, and we're in this town of Nekhen, and here there are guys working to create this sarcophagus, right? And it's creating these beautiful ringing sounds, as I mentioned. And standing nearby is a vizier. This is a guy whose job it is to measure, like a kind of modern day, or an old fashioned rather, quantum, sorry, forgetting the word now. What is it in architecture? Where they measure the work that's being conducted, on a building or whatever. In this case, the vizier is actually measuring how much work these guys are doing on the sarcophagus, right? And in the process, he is seeing in his mind's eye, let's say that this guy is synesthetic, and he is seeing in his mind's eye these beautiful patterns that created by the granite. And so he writes them down, he makes a note on his pad, right? And he says, oh, these are very interesting patterns. I will use these in the development of the hieroglyphic language, right? And then thousands of years later, I go into the pyramid, stretch a membrane across the sarcophagus, and see these very same patterns that have been, embedded in the hieroglyphic language. So that's a kind of very quick overview of how it was that I was able to see these hieroglyphic-like symbols appearing in the sand, sprinkled on the membrane. Yeah.
It opens up all sorts of thoughts about where does language come from, where does the written word come from, where does symbology come from, and I'm afraid that's a rabbit hole we won't have time to go down. Maybe another time. But I would love to have you take it to the street now. We've really gone into some very eye-opening concepts about sound. How does it relate to our ability to heal? How does it relate to our ability to evolve as individuals and as a culture?
Absolutely. It's a very big question, of course, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but, going back to those experiments in the Great Pyramid in 97, where my back was healed and where we saw these amazing hieroglyphs, right? That set me on this journey that I'm still on today in two ways. One was to develop an instrument. It seemed to me that, seeing these hieroglyphs emerge on this membrane could become an important new tool for science. So that set me on the road to developing the CymaScope instrument. And then the other important aspect, of course, was this healing, this almost instantaneous healing, 20 minutes and all the pain gone. That was an astonishing aspect of these experiments. And so all of these years later, more than 2 decades later, I'm still researching why sound heals. And now, as I mentioned, I'm actually writing a chapter for a new medical textbook. So one of the mechanisms that we've already talked about is this oxygenation mechanism. But another concerns what's the science called sonocytology. Now, sonocytology is literally the sounds made by our cells, generated by our cells, emitted by our cells. So all of the cells in your body actually create sound. And this was a discovery made by Professor James Jimzeski of UCLA, and I think it was about 2001. And he made this discovery, and it has very important implications for medical science. And this is, part of what I'm going to relate now in relation to illness. So there are many forms of illness, of course, but one important aspect of illness is that cells in your body can go to sleep. They can literally go into a sleep state. And this sleep state is called the G0 phase in medical terminology. And in this phase, the phase of the cell cycle, the cells are not replicating. They're not doing what they're meant to be doing. So you can have, for example, an illness where a whole system of cells in your body is literally asleep. So the body, therefore, is naturally out of balance. It's not, normally in a healthy person, all the systems of the body are working. They're all in a beautiful, harmonious balance. But in this case, of course, we have a system of the body that's been challenged in some way. Let's say an invasion of a pathogen, or some form of toxicity has entered into our system, or perhaps just a physical trauma. But whatever it is, it means that this system of your body is asleep. And also, while it's asleep, it's not making any sound, by the way. It's silent, okay? It's not generating its normal song, let's say. Sound can provide this means of stimulus, which actually reawakens the cells and brings them back into what's actually called the G1 phase of the cell cycle, which is leading to replication, and division and so on. So
it also sounds like this can be used as a diagnostic tool by listening to the sound of cells.
It absolutely can. And Professor G and I have written a paper, which, as you mentioned at the very beginning, was published in the Water Journal, differentiating between the sounds of cancer cells and healthy cells. So a cancer cell, when you listen to it, you can distinguish particular dissonant notes, which when made visible with the CymaScope instrument, become obviously kind of skewed and ugly, what we would subjectively think of as ugly patterns, right? But if you make the sound of a healthy cell visible, it creates beautiful harmony, beautiful geometries. And so this very aspect of cymatic science can help, for example, a surgeon to determine exactly where the margins of a tumor lie. When a surgeon is tasked with removing a tumor, he or she has to know exactly where the margins lie so that they can only remove the tumor and not any healthy tissue. And of course, apparently, I'm not a surgeon, but apparently it's not that easy to distinguish. So a tool based on cymatic science would allow the surgeon to be able to know exactly how this would work. Is that you would use a thing called a Raman spectroscope, which is actually a laser probe, a laser light. And when this laser light is scanned across the tissues, going from the healthy, say, into the tumor area, then the light is modulated by the sounds of the cells and then demodulated so that the surgeon can actually distinguish exactly where this margin lies, so that they can cut out only the tumor. And also there's a promise here of a future science in which, because cells make sound and each type of cell has its own unique song, it may be possible in the future, by simple laws of resonance, to be able to eradicate cancer cells purely through sound. In other words, you listen into the sound of the cells, greatly amplify it, send that sound back in greatly amplified, therefore destroying the cancer cells. Now, what a wonderful future that would be.
What a wonderful future. And we are out of time for our time together, which is scary. It went so fast, and I can't thank you enough for bringing this leading edge information to our people.
It was a great pleasure to be with you, Gwilda. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. Our guest this hour has been acoustics pioneer and author of Egyptian Sonics, John Stuart Reid. His website, CymaScope.com. Remember, our entire information-packed past episode collection is available for listen or download free of charge. Visit our archives at missionevolution.org for our ever-growing selection of guests and topics. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka, coming to you on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net, and the X Zone TV channel, www.xzonetvchannel.com. Please be sure to join us next time as the mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to an evolving world.